We've all heard about the greatness of the Islamic Caliphates, their grand cities, golden palaces, powerful rulers, and legendary scholars. But there's a side of that history that's rarely discussed. A side built not by kings or poets, but by slaves. Behind every glowing dome of Baghdad, every towering minaret, every scroll of knowledge were forgotten hands. Children stolen from their homes, women silenced in royal chambers, men broken to serve, not live. This is not a story to shame faith. This is a story to honor truth, the truth of the voiceless, the ones who helped build empires but never got a name in the books. In this video, we uncover the most horrifying, yet real, acts committed against slaves during the Islamic Caliphates. You've heard the glory. Now hear the silence beneath it. The child who never became a man. Imagine this: a quiet village at dawn, children playing, mothers preparing bread, a sense of peace, and then chaos. Soldiers on horseback charge in, swords clashing, shouts echoing through the valley. Doors are kicked open, fires lit, and in the middle of it all, an 8-year-old boy is dragged away, screaming, clinging to his mother's arms as she's knocked to the ground. This wasn't just a story. This was the reality for thousands of boys during the height of the Islamic Caliphates. Their destination, not safety, not adoption, slavery, and not just any kind. Some were selected for a life so brutal, most didn't survive past their first year. They were to become eunuchs, slaves permanently altered to serve the empire's elite. The process? Unthinkable. These children were marched across deserts, barefoot and starved. Many died on the way, collapsing from heat or thirst. Those who made it to cities like Baghdad, Damascus, or Cairo were sold in slave markets, their names replaced with numbers, their fates sealed with coin, but their suffering had only just begun. The most valuable among them were taken to secret chambers, where they were held down by men, their limbs tied, and their mouths covered. With no anesthesia, no medicine, and no mercy, they were castrated. Yes, their testicles, and often their genitals entirely, were removed using crude, heated tools. Some bled to death within minutes. Others died from infection days later. But if they lived, they were not free. They were sold for higher prices as eunuchs, now safe to serve inside royal harems, protect noble women, or act as trusted palace servants. Since they couldn't father children or build families, they were seen as less of a threat to royal power. But this trust came with a lifetime of silence. Imagine a boy who never got to grow into a man, who never knew love, who was praised for his obedience, but never given choice, who guarded kings, queens, and princesses, but was never allowed to speak of himself. Many of these eunuchs lived in wealth, but not freedom. They were dressed in silk, lived in marble halls, and carried golden trays, yet they had no family name, no lineage, no legacy. History remembers the kings they served, but not the pain they carried. One Arab historian wrote, "For every 100 boys castrated, perhaps 5 lived. The rest were lost to blood, fever, or grief. But no one mourned them. They weren't buried with honor. They weren't mentioned in prayers. They simply vanished into history's dark corners." This is not a tale of accusation. It's a tale of awareness. Yes, the Islamic Caliphates brought art, science, and architecture to the world. Yes, they inspired generations with poetry and mathematics, but they were also empires, and every empire has shadows. Those eunuch boys, voiceless, broken, erased, were the ones holding the golden plates and opening the royal doors. Their screams weren't heard back then, but maybe, today, they can be remembered. Slave markets, hidden in plain sight. When we imagine ancient Islamic cities like Baghdad, Damascus, or Cairo, we think of beautiful architecture, golden domes, and intellectual greatness. We think of poetry recited in courtyards, and knowledge traded like treasure. But just a few streets away from the libraries and lecture halls, there were markets, slave markets, and these weren't secret, shadowy places hidden in alleyways. They stood in public squares, open, legal, accepted. Slaves were displayed like merchandise, their physical features examined, their ages called out, their qualities exaggerated to attract buyers. There were price tags, there were auctions, and there were people watching silently, some out of curiosity, others out of routine. These markets were so common that entire neighborhoods were built around them. Men in long robes and turbans walked past children being sold. Merchants drank tea while a young girl wept behind a curtain, waiting for her turn. No one questioned it, because this was normal. Slavery wasn't just tolerated, it was a central part of the economy. From the heart of Africa to the cold mountains of Eastern Europe, people were captured, traded, and transported to meet the demands of these markets. Each race, each gender, each age had its category. African men were praised for their strength, used for labor or military. European women were often sold as domestic servants or concubines. Central Asian boys were trained as pages or soldiers. Young children were marketed as obedient and easy to shape. Some were sold 5, 6, even 10 times in their lives. Most never saw their families again. Their names were erased, their language forgotten. They were renamed by their masters, given numbers, titles, or even nicknames in foreign tongues. Many were branded, marked with hot irons to show ownership, not for punishment, but as proof of purchase. The buyers, not just rich rulers, even middle-class families owned slaves, sometimes just one, sometimes several. And the most tragic part? No one saw anything wrong with it. Religious scholars at the time wrote entire manuals on how to treat slaves, what to feed them, what to allow, and what not to. There were rules, yes, but rules don't make slavery humane. They only make it efficient. Inside these markets, some slaves were made to perform, sing, cook, recite poetry to increase their price. Others were kept silent, their bodies judged instead. The atmosphere, not loud, not wild, but cold, businesslike. It was a marketplace of pain, hidden behind manners and gold. Historians today agree. The sophistication of these slave markets shows how deeply slavery was embedded in society, not as a flaw, but as a function. And that's what makes it even more chilling, because it wasn't done in hate, it was done in habit. People saw slavery not as evil, but as ordinary. That's what history warns us about. Not just cruelty, but normalized cruelty. Pain that becomes invisible because it is everywhere. As we walk through the golden cities of the past in our minds, let's not forget the footprints of those who walked there, but never freely. They carried the bricks, they cooked the food, they cleaned the palaces. They were the human foundation under the empire's marble floors. Their markets may be gone, but their silence still echoes. The lives they lived, silenced in luxury. Not all slaves lived in chains. Some walked through marble halls, wore fine linen, served food in golden bowls. But make no mistake, they were still slaves. Inside the palaces of the Islamic Caliphates, many slaves lived lives that, from the outside, looked almost royal. They had access to gardens, pools, libraries, and lavish rooms, but that beauty hid something far darker, a life without freedom, without choice, without voice. They were cooks, guards, musicians, personal attendants, even caretakers of the caliph's children. They woke before dawn, worked silently through the day, and slept only when their masters allowed. They were called trusted, valued, or even beloved. But that trust was never respect, it was control. For example, in the royal kitchens, slave chefs prepared enormous feasts for hundreds. They learned spices, techniques, and secrets passed down from generations, but none of those secrets belonged to them. They cooked, but never ate with the guests. They were present, but never acknowledged. In the royal courts, musicians and entertainers were trained to sing, play instruments, and recite poetry to entertain noble families. Some became famous inside the palace walls, yet they had no last names, no families of their own, no wealth from their art. Their joy was performance. Their silence was survival. Even the bodyguards of the caliphs, strong men in beautiful uniforms, always near power, were often eunuchs. Their strength was used to protect royalty, but they could never build legacies of their own. And the most heartbreaking part? Some of them were grateful, because unlike slaves who worked in farms or mines, these palace servants had food, clothes, and sometimes even a bed of their own. They weren't whipped daily, they weren't locked in chains, so many of them convinced themselves, maybe this isn't so bad, maybe I'm lucky, but they weren't lucky. They were trapped in golden cages. Many lived their entire lives serving one family. They watched generations rise and fall, sons become kings, daughters get married, rulers grow old and die. And yet they remained, nameless, stateless, forgotten. They could not marry without permission. They could not own property. They could not choose where to go, or what to believe, or who to be. Even if they served with loyalty for decades, they were never free, and when they died, they were not buried in royal tombs. Their names were not carved in stone. Most of them were buried quietly outside city walls, in simple graves, unmarked, unvisited. Historians say, the Islamic empires gave them food, clothes, and purpose, but took their futures. That's the tragedy. These people kept the palaces running, cleaned the marble floors, held the torches during ceremonies, rocked the cradles of royal babies, yet they were ghosts inside history's most beautiful buildings. If walls could speak, they'd tell stories of songs sung through tears, of food served by hands that never tasted it, of armor worn by men who never fought for themselves. Luxury without liberty is not a reward. It is a quiet kind of cruelty, the kind that doesn't leave scars on the skin, but on the soul. Today we remember them, not for the gold they held, but for the chains we couldn't see. Women and forgotten stories. History often remembers kings and warriors, but it forgets the quiet figures behind closed doors, the women who never wrote books, never led armies, yet lived through the harshest truths of empire. In the Islamic Caliphates, female slaves lived lives of contradiction. They were both invisible and constantly watched, silenced but surrounded by words, trapped not always in chains but in palaces. Many of these women were taken as young girls, captured during wars, raids, or bought from distant lands. They were brought into noble homes, palaces, and harems, not just as servants, but as possessions. Some worked in the kitchens, some cleaned halls, some nursed children they did not birth, and raised boys who would one day become their masters. They weren't allowed to speak freely, they weren't allowed to leave. Their thoughts, feelings, and even bodies were not their own, and while the world outside saw the palaces as places of beauty, luxury, and poetry, inside, many of these women lived lives of fear, routine, and isolation. One of the most hidden roles was that of the harem slave. The word harem today is misunderstood, often romanticized, but in reality, harems were tightly controlled, walled spaces where royal women and female slaves were kept. They were ruled by strict codes, and in many cases, those inside never saw the outside world again. Slave women in harems were expected to serve the royal women, entertain them, prepare their clothes, do their hair, and sometimes please the rulers when summoned. But none of it was choice. It was duty, enforced by fear. And yet, many of these women were highly skilled. They learned languages, poetry, music. Some became advisors, interpreters, or even wielded quiet influence behind the scenes. But still, they were never free. They had no last names, no right to refuse, no family to protect them. Even if they bore children for their masters, those children did not guarantee them protection. In some caliphates, if a slave woman gave birth to a son, she might gain a special status called Walad, but that didn't always mean freedom. She could still be sold, punished, or discarded. And when their youth faded, when beauty no longer protected them, many were passed down to other households. Some were quietly dismissed. Others were simply forgotten. Historians say, for every royal consort remembered by name, there were 1,000 unnamed women who served, suffered, and disappeared. Some of these women tried to preserve their dignity through art, stories, or teaching younger girls, but their words rarely reached the outside world. They had no diaries, no portraits, no tombstones, only a faint presence in official records. Female slave, age unknown, value estimated. Today, when we see the ruins of ancient palaces, we think of kings, caliphs, poets, but we should also think of them, the women whose voices never rose above a whisper. They were not warriors, but survivors. They were not rulers, but they endured. They were not remembered, but they mattered. They deserve more than silence. They deserve memory. Legacy of the Forgotten. They had no statues, no names in history books, no stories told at bedtime. But they were there, everywhere. They built the palaces, cooked the feasts, swept the stones walked by kings, and yet the world forgot them. The slaves of the Islamic Caliphates, men, women, and children, are rarely mentioned when we celebrate the empire's achievements. We remember the architecture, the science, the poetry, the libraries, but not the hands that carried the bricks, the backs that bent under weight, the lives that were erased to make others shine. This is not just about cruelty, it's about absence. These people existed, millions of them. They lived, loved, cried, hoped, and then disappeared into dust without anyone to remember. Some were worked to death, others lived for decades in silence, obeying orders, watching generations pass. Many were born into slavery, died in slavery, and never even knew what freedom felt like. Their graves, if any, were unmarked. No marble, no name, just forgotten bones beneath the soil of cities they helped build. And yet they were the foundation. They were the shadow behind every glowing candle, the breath behind every whispered prayer in royal mosques, the silence between every verse of golden poetry. They lived in the margins of a golden age, never golden themselves, but always holding it up. Some historians argue that slavery was normal back then, that everyone did it, that it was legal, religiously justified, and economic. And perhaps that's true, but what is legal is not always right. What is normal is not always just. Empires are often measured by what they built, but they should also be measured by who paid the price for that greatness. Slavery in the Islamic world wasn't always brutal in the way we imagine, with whips and chains. Sometimes it wore a robe, spoke gently, smiled kindly, but it still took freedom. It still owned people. It still erased lives. Today, the grand cities remain, at least in ruins. Tourists walk the paths once swept by slaves. Historians write books about caliphs and battles, and we talk about golden ages as if they came from the sky. But beneath every stone there's a story, and many of those stories were never told because no one bothered to ask. This video is not just about exposing the past, it's about remembering the invisible, the men who never had sons, the women who never spoke their minds, the children who never saw home again. They were not kings, they were not scholars, they were not poets, but they were human, and humanity deserves memory. So as we close this story, remember, history is not only what's written, it's what's forgotten. Let us honor them not with guilt, but with truth, not with shame, but with recognition, because only when we remember the forgotten can we finally call our history complete. History doesn't always remember the silent ones, but you just did. If this story moved you, even for a moment, imagine how many others have never heard it. Share this video. Subscribe for more untold truths. Leave a comment. Your voice might speak for someone who never had one. We don't just make history videos. We give a voice to those the world forgot. Thank you for watching, and never stop remembering what others chose to ignore.